Well, welcome back to another episode of A Body of Divinity. It's been a little while since I put one of these up, but I thought, I got to get through. Watson's great work on theology, and we've got to make it through it. It's such good content, and when I picked it back up and I read what we're going to look at today, which is his chapter on sanctification, I thought, man, I missed my time with Watson. So let's dive right back into it. We're looking at sanctification today. Remember, we're in the last section of this book, which is the section that you might think of as the practical theology section, or the application of salvation to the life of the believer. And because we're talking about that, obviously it's going to be very, very practical, because as you have the grace of God applied to us, to the sinner, we're going to be talking about the life of the believer and the life in the faith. So that's really what we're looking at. That's where we are. And specifically today, we're looking at sanctification, which Watson starts out with quoting from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, which says, "For this is the will of God, even your sanctification." Some Christians might think, well, okay, but I know that I need to believe in Jesus. I need to believe that he died for me. I need to trust that that's true, that he is my only way of salvation. But the idea that we are to somehow be conformed to a particular way of living and being in the world, and certain practices that we should do and ought to do or ought not to do, some believers would say, that is just that's legalism, and we can't be about that. We can't say things like that, because we'll get into works righteousness, and we have to be very, very careful. But the problem with that is, and of course we should always be careful of saying that we can earn our salvation through the good works that we do. That's not true, and that's not really what sanctification is even talking about, which we'll see here in a little bit. But at the same time, we need to be aware of the scriptural passages that clearly say that we're not just saved for the sake of being saved. We're not merely saved for the sake of avoiding judgment and hell, but we are saved in order that we might be conformed to the image of Christ, that we might be made holy as God is holy, that indeed the will of God is what? That we would be sanctified, that the bride of Christ would be purified in that way. So clearly from all of this, and we're going to keep seeing this, the scriptural language, the scriptural commands, the scriptural imagery, it's all really, really clear that Christians must be sanctified. It's not even really an optional thing at all. Now, when we're talking about sanctification, now there's all kinds of ways that we could divide this up, but we're looking at Thomas Watson, and so I'm trying to follow Watson in order to give you a good, clear representation of what Watson says, and Watson is really representative of that whole kind of Puritan post-Reformation time period, and certainly there's lots of range within the Puritan tradition. You can't just say, well, if Watson said it, that means they all believed it. So you have to be careful with that. But generally speaking, Watson is a good representative of, by and large and for the most part, what Puritans believed, what they taught, how they divided things up. This is generally speaking a pretty helpful thing. Although again, there's more to it. There's more to it. You remember, Watson here is not trying to be exhaustive by any means. But this is Watson saying, look, you can divide sanctification up into a negative part and a positive part. The negative part, or the privation part, means that, look, sin is in the scriptures often talked about as a leaven that sours. Think of 1 Corinthians 5 and this man who's been caught in a very grievous sin, and Paul says you need to come together and you need to set him outside of the assembly, or else his sin will leaven the whole lump. Sin is like a disease. Think of leprosy for instance, in Leviticus. It's like a disease that defiles. So sanctification is then a purging, a mortifying, putting to death of this old leaven, as Paul puts it in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. There's also a positive part, or a refining part, as Watson puts it, and this is becoming sanctified is like renewal. So if you think of Romans chapter 12, verse 2, famous passage, right, to be renewed in our minds. 2 Peter 1:4, sometimes we forget about this one, but to be sanctified is to partake of the divine nature. Now, that doesn't mean that you become God, but when Peter said that, if you read the context, some people twist it to mean that you become God or become divinized. That's not at all what Peter's saying. But if you read it in its context, it's very clear when he says to partake of the divine nature means to be conformed to his image, or to be morally like him, to be holy as he is holy, right? It's a very similar kind of thing being said there. It's a washing away of sin. Now, I'm not going to cover everything in this chapter because it's just, there's so much here. It's a very, very rich chapter, like a lot of these chapters. But there's a few lists that I thought were just really good. So let's just look at each list and discuss them a little bit briefly. So the first one is, he goes through 7 aspects. And again, this is really helpful for understanding what sanctification is, and also what sanctification isn't. So the first one is supernatural. It's a supernatural thing. So sanctification is a supernatural thing. This means that sanctification is not just you pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. It's not just you doing, as best you can with what you have. That's not what it is. Sanctification is actually the work of God's grace in you. And this is why Paul never boasts and says like, oh, I'm just so holy, I'm so great. Even when he says that he's worked hard to do what God has called him to do, he always will say, but it's not me, it's Christ in me, right? It's the work of God in me. All right. This is important when it comes to our sanctification, that we not become haughty or prideful or arrogant when we see, by God's grace, growth in holiness. That's a wonderful thing, but actually to become sanctified, to become a mature believer, part of what that looks like is recognizing, man, oh man, this was not me, this is the work of God in me. Second, it's an intrinsic thing. So sanctification is first in the heart, and that means that we can't we can't merely, now I'm not saying the external stuff is not important, but we can't merely look at the external evidences and know for sure, only God can do this, know for sure what's going on inside of a person's heart. And the thing about sanctification that Watson is trying to convey here is that purifying process is it's first an intrinsic, it's a in the heart kind of a thing first. And then our third one says here, and then it works itself out into the rest of us as well. And when he says, number 3, it's an extensive thing, part of what Watson is getting at there, which is really important, and he goes into some detail here, it's a really helpful section, but he says, look, it's not just an intellectual thing. So it can't just be a doctrinal understanding thing. It's not just an emotional thing or a sort of affections thing. It's not just the choices we make, right? What kind of habits we develop and choices that we end up making. It's all of those things. It's all of those things. And Watson was firmly in the tradition that understood the soul of man to be united and one, and yet at the same time, they would say that even though it's one united thing, they would also divide it up in some ways, and some of them would understand this differently, but they divide it up into faculties. And the primary sort of faculties that they would talk about would be the mind, would be the will, would be the affections. And when he says sanctification is an extensive thing, he's saying it works its way out through all of these different aspects of the soul. And then, of course, he's also saying that it works itself out into the world around us. So Number 4, it's an ardent thing. Number 5, it's a beautiful thing. Number 6, it's an abiding thing. So it's not just something that kind of pops up for a little while and then disappears. That can be evidence of false sanctification, but that's not true sanctification. And then number 7 is a really, really important one. And this is something we often talk about with sanctification. It's a progressive thing, right? It's a progressive thing. So it is a slow, arduous process. And we ought not to think that we can ever in this life become absolutely perfect. This is what some Wesleyans or Methodists have taught. It's false. It's completely unbiblical. Go read 1 John. You'll see that it's a completely unbiblical idea. It's a progressive thing, though. It's something that slowly we go from immaturity to maturity, from milk to meat. There's process and growth, and this is what we see all throughout the scriptures. Now, our second list is, and this is a really important one, counterfeit sanctification. Counterfeit sanctification. So 5 examples of counterfeit sanctification. I thought this was a really, really helpful piece that Watson gives us here. The first one, he says, is when we see people who are moral or civil. Okay, so there's a civility about them, a morality about them. And he even lists off here some great philosophers, Plato and Aristotle and Seneca and Cicero, these kinds of guys. And he say, there's a civility and morality about them, but this is not the same as biblical sanctification or Christian sanctification. He says this, he says, civility is but nature refined. There is nothing of Christ there, and the heart may be foul and impure. So just because you have, and this goes back to the sanctification being first intrinsic, if you just have this outward civility, that's not necessarily sanctification. That can really be a counterfeit. Second is superstitious devotion, and Watson does point out here Roman Catholicism, popery, as he calls it. Certainly, this would not just be Roman Catholics by any means, but he uses this, especially in his context, in his day. This is a prime example. And he says something really helpful. He says, look, religious frenzy is far from sanctification. Protestants, we've got all kinds of religious frenzy. Just think of the charismatic movement. Just think of some of the high church stuff that's in our own traditions. Think about some of the, not to pick on the charismatic, but some of our sort of contemporary movements that are highly therapeutic and emotional. And honestly, some of these Christians, they're brothers and sisters in the Lord, but they have so elevated being contemporary, relevant, certain sort of worship styles, and they'll think music is what worship is, and as if that's synonymous. But they'll see certain music and certain worship, and they'll say, if you don't have this stuff, then you're just a dead church, right? Why is that? Well, there's a superstitious devotion to certain liturgical, they wouldn't call it that, but liturgical practices, and they get a lot of emotional payoff with this sort of stuff. What is that? Same sort of thing as popery, as Watson was talking about. It's religious frenzy, but that is not necessarily sanctification. That can actually be a counterfeit. There's all kinds of examples that we could give for that. The third one is hypocrisy. He says, when men make pretense of that holiness which they have not. When men make pretense of that holiness which they have not. This is always something that we have to be checking our own heart. Am I presenting myself as more holy than I really am? Am I selling a holiness that I don't actually have? The fourth one is restraining grace, and the fifth one, common grace. And I think these two things are kind of two sides of the same coin. But restraining grace, he says, there's no change of heart. And this is really good. He says sin is curbed but not cured. Sin is curbed but not cured. God keeps us from being as wicked and evil as we could be. right? As a good Calvinist, I believe in total depravity, right? But that doesn't mean that every individual is as bad as they could be. It just means that all of them is impacted by sin. But restraining grace, sometimes we can confuse restraining grace, right? Somebody might not be as bad as they could be, with sanctification. Well, that's not really the same thing. Common grace, we can look at the work of God in the world to, as he says, give light to people's judgment, right? But that's not the same as being humbled under the mighty hand of God. They may have some checks of conscience to help them to know kind of the right thing to do in this situation or that situation. But that's not the same as biblical sanctification. So restraining grace, common grace, not the same thing. Last little list here before we wrap things up, 5 practical means of sanctification. He says, first off, know the Bible. That's an easy one. As far as knowing that we should know it, it's much harder to actually be in your Bible every day and to be in it in a way that is not just rote, not just merely doing it, checking it off, but actually being sure to engage with the Lord as we do it, to meditate as we do it. The second one, have faith in Christ's purifying blood. Notice how Watson here is kind of going in steps, that we come to the knowledge of saving faith. We actually trust in the Lord. Then we breathe after the Spirit, as he says. So he's a little bit vague in what he means by this, but I think we can all appreciate it, that sanctification is by the power of the Spirit working within a believer, and so we need to walk with the Spirit, breathe after the Spirit, as he says. Number 4, associate with sanctified persons. This is really important stuff. Sometimes Christians think, well, I can't be around other Christians because I need to go out and be evangelizing. Well, you're not going to be a very good evangelist if you're not very holy, all right? If you're not growing and being sanctified. And a big part of how that happens is by associating with a local church, by worshiping every Lord's Day with your fellow brothers and sisters in the Lord, by being with other Christians throughout your week, having a very close tie and relationship to them. And number 5, pray for sanctification. So those are 5 practical means of sanctification that we should all be careful to observe as Christians. Next time, we'll keep moving through this practical section in a body of divinity, and we'll be wrapping it up in a handful of weeks. I'm thinking about doing a series of some book reviews, some good books, just doing kind of one video, brief little videos, just kind of telling you some highlights about a book, some really helpful insights, and giving some recommendations as well as some critiques for some different books. So that's something to look forward to. We'll see you next time.